staircase to your right, which will exit onto Colton Road, the muster point for the inquiry. Please follow these instructions unless advised otherwise by a fire marshal, and if in doubt, follow the green emergency exit signs. Do take a moment to familiarise yourself with our hearing suite etiquette. This can be found on the hearing suite TV screens now. There is a cafe on the ground floor selling hot drinks and snacks, but we kindly request that you only consume water in the hearing suite. You can help yourself to water in glasses, which you can find in the kitchen next to our reception desk. Inquiry staff are wearing orange lanyards. Please approach them if you require assistance. Please ensure that your phones, laptops and any electronic devices are on silent mode. Device screens may be captured on the broadcast during wide shots of the hearing suite. All attendees are kindly asked to stand when the inquiry chair enters and leaves the hearing room. A member of the inquiry team will inform you when to stand. Please remain at your seats until the chair and witnesses have left the room. Thank you for your attention. The hearing will start in a few moments.
No. Good morning, Ms. Barami.
Good morning, my lord. Our first panel this morning is the National Association of Funeral Directors. We have James Blackburn, Nick Britton, Robert Tripney and Tim Purves.
No. Good morning to you all, gentlemen. Good morning.
Good morning, Lord.
Good. When you're ready, Ms. Barami.
Thank you, Lord. Firstly, I'd like to confirm that you all took part in a roundtable discussion with the inquiry, and following that, Mr. Purves provided a statement to the inquiry. Is that correct? Yes, and correct. That statement reference number for the purposes of the record is SCI-WT0623-501. I'd like to remind you that the proceedings today are being transcribed, so I'd ask that you speak slowly and clearly and try not to speak over each other, which I'm sure you wouldn't do. I'd also like to remind you that there is a restriction order in place. So when you mention the names of, when you are speaking about your experiences, please don't mention the names of any private individuals. You can refer to their roles or your relationship with them, but not any names, please. Can we start by you each telling His Lordship a little about your background, your role in the organisation and the job that you hold, please. If we start with you, Mr. Blackburn.
Thank you. Good morning. James Blackburn. I'm the head of funerals for Scott Mead Cooperative, based in Edinburgh. I've been in the funeral profession since 1990.
My name is Nick Britton. My background is in journalism, media and communications, and I'm the communications lead for Scotland and Northern Ireland for the National Association of Funeral Directors.
I'm Robert Tripney. I've been in the funeral industry for 15 years. I started out working for one of the largest companies in the UK, and I'm now the funeral service manager of an independent funeral service in Glasgow.
Good morning, Lord Brailsford. My name is Tim Purvis. I am the Chief Exec of William Purvis Funeral Directors, which is an independent company with 28 branches throughout Scotland. I am also currently the Scottish President of the National Association of Funeral Directors.
Thank you. Firstly, Mr. Purvis, apologies for mispronouncing your name.
That's okay.
With the announcement of lockdown, obviously restrictions were put in place generally in society, but I understand that guidance wasn't put in place for funeral venues yet at that point and for funerals generally, and things happened quickly, so you had limited time to prepare. I understand that each venue at that point had to put in place their own restrictions and guidelines. How did you find dealing with that, and what were the effects of that?
Several fold, really. One of the key issues that we faced and one of the problems that we faced was that the guidance was issued and implementation of guidance was immediate. And so funeral directors and families and venues had to move incredibly quickly. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. And the problems that we faced, and I think Tim's going to provide an example in just a moment, but one of the problems we faced was that there simply wasn't enough time for funeral directors to inform families or for families to make their own necessary arrangements if, for example, the number of people who were allowed to attend a funeral was reduced. Now, that led to some very difficult conversations that funeral directors had to have with families. And I think an important learning out of this is that in any future public health emergency, it's absolutely vital that there is a period of implementation allowed in between guidance and that guidance coming into operation. But Tim, I know that you can talk to this a little bit more in terms of what's happening on the ground.
Yes. Initially, before any guidance came out, it was up to each venue to make their own rules as to what they would allow. And there were situations where, for example, there was a cemetery that made the decision that only 5 people could attend, and that included the clergy who was taking the funeral service, along with 2 of our staff, which left 2 people from the family could attend a funeral. But then we would have other venues that would allow much larger numbers. But then what happened is when the guidance came in, it came in with immediate effect. And often it was late on in the day that guidance came in, and it was reduced to 20 people could attend a funeral service. And there were situations where we, the funeral director, were left having to contact family members that evening for a funeral service that was going to be taking place the next morning to say, I know you were hoping that 50 people were going to attend this funeral tomorrow, but unfortunately the guidance has changed with immediate effect, and now only 20 people can attend. And it was a very difficult conversation that we were left having to have, where family were not aware of this guidance being issued. Mm-hmm. And so the first they were hearing about it was from ourselves, making contact with them. And obviously they were left in the difficult situation of having to phone people to tell them that some of them could not come to the funeral any longer.
Yes, thank you. Can I ask, how long did it take to arrange funerals during the pandemic compared to before the pandemic?
James?
at the beginning, there was really no difference in the amount of time between date of death and the date of the funeral itself. But I think as time went on, the number of deaths increased, and the capacity of funeral directors with the staff available meant that lengthened as we were bringing more deceased into our care. I think that, along with the associated difficulty in registration, which was becoming online, but moving over to that system. So then we were running to 2 to 3 weeks from date of death to date of funeral. This was despite the crematoriums lengthening their opening hours, so to speak, but we still only had the same number of our trained staff to carry out the same number of funerals. So I think most funeral directors were getting, certainly we were getting to the point where we were at the capacity in terms of refrigeration and caring for the deceased, because the funerals were taking longer to happen.
Thank you. And so presumably while the funerals were taking longer, guidance was changing during that period, perhaps more than once. Can you tell us what issues that created, both for you as funeral directors and for the families, of adjusting things multiple times, and families' ability to hold funerals in accordance with their religious or cultural traditions, and also whether the families were aware of the guidance changes from the Scottish Government, from hearing it from the Scottish Government, or whether it fell on you to inform them of that?
I think it's a very kind of broad question, that, because it was changing dramatically, within a few miles of where you could be. A lot of people were seeing or hearing the guidance being issued by the government, but then wondering why the local authority had alternative guidance in place. In terms of the registration, there is certain faiths require quicker registration because of the way the religion works.
No, we've heard that already.
Yeah, so they need to carry out certain things within a time period, which then caused a bit of aggravation with other families saying, well, why is it taking us 2-3 weeks? And they're not interested in the religious aspect. All they see is a time barrier. So the guidance in general was, as a funeral director, you're the face of everybody that you represent. So whether that's a crematorium facility or the clergy or the government or anybody. So we were having to deal with that on the ground on a daily basis, on top of everything we were dealing with.
And
I think, sorry, if I may add, Ms. Farami, there's a wider issue here in terms of families receiving guidance, in as much as there was often a lot of discrepancy between what the UK government was saying and what the Scottish government was saying. And families would see stuff happening on the 6 o'clock news, so if the Prime Minister was announcing guidance, and they would start going down that road, only to find that maybe 12 or 24 hours later the Scottish Government was issuing completely different guidance. And I think from our sector, and certainly on behalf of the association, we felt that in any future public health emergency like this, it's really important that the governments work closer together. We did feel that there was a real disconnect between the Scottish Government and the UK Government, and what that was for, they will know, whether it's political reasons or whatever it might be. But it led to a lot of difficulty for families and for bereaved people. It led to confusion sort of within, in terms of what guidance they were meant to abide by, and often it was funeral directors who were left to have that difficult conversation with them.
Yes.
Could I come in on that as well? We operate part of our business in the northeast of England, so we have branches in England and branches in Scotland, and obviously there was different guidance. So even just from the purpose of running a business, it became very difficult on how to guide our staff on what rules they have to follow when it was different. So I would just echo what Nick said there, that if there was a more consistency, that would be very helpful.
Can I go a little bit ahead, I suspect? We may be going here, and I apologise, Mr. Brown, if we do that. But there came, of course, a stage when in Scotland there were different tiers. And I think we've heard already from the clerics that different rules applied in different parts of the country. Now, Mr. Purvis, presumably your business covers a number of local authority regions, I suspect. Mr. Timpney, you're exactly the same. Not so sure about you, but perhaps even in Lothian it covers that, it changes as well. Did that cause you problems if there were different rules for the same sort of reasons, but perhaps on a more micro level than the differences between the UK government and the Scottish government?
I think My lord, it did. It did across across the profession. Absolutely, it did, because people were having to have families in different tiers and potentially having to try and move between different tiers when you were allowed to, and it did become very confusing, because what you were generally getting were potentially 3 or 4 different levels of guidance. Yeah. You've got the UK government, you've got the Scottish government, you've got the more localised guidance, and it was really confusing for bereaved people who, let's not forget, are having to receive and digest this news in a state of anxiety, of worry, of bereavement. So they've got enough to deal with, if you like, without then having a lot of this guidance and not quite sure really where to look and what they can do with it. Yeah. And who do we believe? Which bit of this guidance it does actually refer to us?
Can I also just come in very quickly on the cultural question? Mm-hmm. We've already touched upon it there, that different cultural faiths have different sort of ways that they like to operate. So, for example, we would do quite a lot of the Jewish funerals, and when someone of the Jewish faith dies, then somebody of the same sex would want to wash the body and prepare them. And when the rules stated that we were in bubbles and only people from the same household could be in a room together, it made things like that very difficult as well. I think the other thing as well is that our job as funeral directors was not necessarily to police everything that happened. And our job was to make sure that people knew what the rules were. But it did at times feel like we were put in quite a difficult situation when, with different groups, people would attend, and clearly they might not have been from the same household, but we were really there not to police that, but just to maybe just reiterate what the rules currently are as they stand.
Thank you. Going back slightly, you mentioned that often local authorities had different rules to the Scottish Government. I wondered, was that when different local authorities were in different tiers, or more generally? And if it was more generally, were the differences significant, and were you ever given a reason why the local authorities had chosen to impose different rules to the government?
I would say it was more generally. I think the view that I took, and I can say this for funeral directors as well, is that each individual company then assessed the risk for its own team of staff and the public coming there. And so regardless of the tiers, it was because they had risk assessed a service room as being only so small, and they wanted to protect their staff. So they would bring in, whether it was a lot of PPE and they were dressed in that, or whether it was just a restriction on the number of people. So I think it was their assessment on top of the government assessment.
So to clarify, by local authority, you mean venues in different local authority areas rather than the local authority itself?
Yes, that's right. Yes. And also there are private cemeteries in Scotland. And so, again, as a private company, they made a decision how they would protect and safeguard, I guess, their staff and their team, and then as well the people coming in to use their facilities.
How did you find dealing with the different venues? Was that a smooth negotiation or discussion, or did you encounter difficulties there?
Can I? So, in terms of the local authorities, I think a lot of the time it was down to how they interpreted the guidance as well. It was being interpreted differently, even in different venues. So if one local authority has 10 cemeteries, you know, in 5 of those cemeteries, the guidance could have been interpreted differently from the other 5. It was difficult at times because, unfortunately, during COVID, there was people attending more than one funeral during lockdowns, and they could go to a funeral one week and experience certain restrictions, and then go to a funeral the next week and it could be completely relaxed, but they didn't know any difference between that. And then having to try and explain that to a family with the guidance, but it's been interpreted differently by this local authority, was difficult. And then it would go right down to the staff at said venue, you know, kind of doing how they felt comfortable with. So it was very difficult at times trying to manage that.
Yes, thank you. And I get a sense that from what you've said that you were concerned about the relationship between you as funeral directors and the bereaved families. What do you perceive to be your duty toward bereaved families? And do you think the nature and pace of guidance interfered with that duty?
Right. So our main job as a funeral director, our main job and what we strive to achieve is to allow a family to grieve and let us take on the burden of all the administrative issues behind it. We really struggled with that during COVID. One of the things that I was always told as a funeral director in my training many years ago was we don't tell families no, we'll always find an alternative for them. COVID was the first time I'd ever had to turn around and say no to a family, which as someone who does this as a caring professional was extremely, extremely difficult for me to do. And there was no alternative. There was no alternative to it. You had to just tell them no. That's the way it was. And as Nick touched on earlier, when you have a family who are already very distressed, very upset, not just for the fact that they just lost a loved one, but they're also dealing with COVID in their own right, or the lockdowns in their own right, for us then to tell them they can't say goodbye properly at their loved one was huge, absolutely huge.
I was just going to add, I think a big part of our job is a conversation with families. We don't tend to arrange a funeral by going through a checklist and ticking everything off. We tend to have a conversation with families, and so we build up a relationship with them. And I think what was very difficult during COVID is with all the barriers that were put in place, not being able to meet in person. When we do meet them in person, there's face masks and there's no physical contact and distance involved and things. It just meant that a lot of that personalisation that we would often have through a conversation, we didn't feel that we were able to build up a relationship with the families in the same way. And I'm sure they probably felt that as well.
Yeah. And did that duty then cause further difficulties between you and the venues that you were dealing with? Because we will hear from the venues as well, and they might comment on the relationship there. So do you feel that that created further tensions when you were attempting to meet the wishes of the family? The venues had their own interpretation. You, of course, had your interpretation. The families would have had theirs. Was that a source of difficulty?
There was many issues with venues in themselves, especially when we introduced like track and trace. So the track and trace became a major object to deal with, because you would have some crematoriums wanting the track and trace details supplied to them the day before the funeral. Now, not everybody could guarantee they were going to make it. The next day somebody could be not feeling well, so they couldn't get out. So then they couldn't exactly phone somebody else and say, you can come and fill this space. That was also a massive logistical issue, because you're limited to time at a crematorium, and if you turn up and you then have 20 people having to give names, addresses, phone numbers, and then, not in anywhere particular, but we fully believe that these track and trace documents were then just placed in a folder at the side or sat on a shelf and were never actioned, or nothing ever came of them. But again, I believe that's the interpretation from said venue, from the guidance, just that they had to do it. I don't think they were told what they had to do with it when they got the information, but they were just told to obtain the information from clients. But again, it just became another stumbling block for a family when you had to say, by the way, you've got 20 people to come, but you also need to supply us with their names, dates, phone numbers. And at times, I fully believe that all the names and dates and phone numbers on it weren't all the people who were there.
Some of the venues took the guidance different to others, in the sense that some venues actually had a member of staff that literally counted the 20 people as they came in. And when they reached number 21, they sort of said, nope, you're not coming in. Now, the difficulty sometimes was that that person was actually a very close relative, and somebody else had actually gone in ahead of them. And so there were times when we were having to go in and actually almost fish people back out and say, I'm really sorry, but this very close relative has to come in, so you need to come out. What then happened was that people were able to stand outside of the venue. So I'm talking about at a crematorium, for example, and they would put on speakers so that they could still hear the service. But then guidance came that that was not to happen any longer either. So we then had the difficulty that we would tell families 20 people, but if 25 turned up, 5 are not going in, and that 5 are not allowed to stand around outside. And so we were really having to tell them that they need to now leave. And so it created difficulties. Some venues took it that way. Other venues were more relaxed about that and felt, well, if they're in the open air and they're socially distancing, it really doesn't matter too much if 5 of them are sort of standing outside.
Thank you.
Can I ask just a question that has occurred to me, which we haven't had any evidence on? I think we've had a habit of talking about cremations. You'll tell me if I'm wrong, but certainly perhaps I'm giving away cultural background here, but cremations seem to be far more common. I think I've only actually been to about 1 or 2 outside funerals in my entire life, but I've been to an awful lot more than that, cremations. But outside funerals do exist, do get carried on still, and they're outside by definition. The same number of rules apply to these things outside, where there was much more scope at least for larger gatherings.
Yes, my lord. The same rules applied whether it was indoor or outdoor. We, as a company, had an example where we had a funeral that was taking place outside. It was a burial. And during the funeral service, 4 police officers turned up in a car. And actually, they had been informed that there was more than 20 people attending this funeral. And the 4 police officers came up and stopped the funeral while they counted the people that was there. My funeral director, who was there, tried to plead with them to say, look, you can stand back here and count, you can see there's less than 20, but they insisted on doing this. And his comment to them was, there's 4 of you arriving in a car together, and you're more concerned about the fact that in the open air here there might be more than 20 people. It just felt at times that the rules were taking over sort of sensibility.
Yeah, rational analysis wasn't
Yes.
taking place. Are you able to tell me, if you're not, just tell me, for how long did the ban on large numbers at outside funerals persist?
It was the same length of time as everything else, yes. Yes.
Do you happen to know if any representations were made by persons like yourself representing the profession to government about this? I'm perhaps getting ahead of myself, sorry, Mr. Brown.
I would have thought it was likely. I can't say yes or no for sure, my lord, but I thought it would be likely because it was raised at the time.
Could you possibly check that point, and if you can find some more information, simply write to us with the information. It's not your fault that you don't have it to hand now, but it would be useful to know if representations about this matter were made to government.
I'll be very happy to do so.
Thank you.
If I can just mention, my lord, I mean, Nick, you'll probably remember better than me, but I know that certainly questions were asked about the size of venues. The rule of 20 didn't matter if the venue was very, very large and could seat 300 people normally, or whether it was an awful lot smaller. And now, as long as there was a 2-metre gap between people and you could get up to 20 people in that building, that room, then it was 20. But it did at times feel that a huge, large room with only 20 people in 2 metres apart, we could have probably allowed more people in that room. But it was a blanket rule of 20. And you've already mentioned, my lord, about outside where there was, more space even, and, we're in the open air, but again, it was still a rule of 20.
Perhaps, Mr. Briston, if I expand my request, if you could cover those points as well, if there are any representations.
We certainly, without a shadow of a doubt, we did make representation on that matter because there were lots of examples, as Tim has pointed out there.
If you could simply provide us with the actual factual information of when you made the representations and so forth.
Of course.
Thank you.
Can I just very briefly touch on that as well? One of the issues we came up with outside funerals was a lot of these burial grounds are owned by local authorities, so are and therefore public property. So we had a few issues where we attended funerals at burial sites, and there was more than the allocated or government guidance number of people attending, where then the families were getting into arguments with the staff at the cemetery, was saying, well, you can't tell me to leave because this is public property and I'm allowed outside. The cemetery staff would then turn that onto us, where in essence, and the guys here that are funeral directors will back this up, when we drive through the gates of a crematorium or a cemetery, we are under their jurisdiction, so we follow their rules. So our rebuttal to that was, well, you should have someone standing at the gate telling people they can't come in, or you should have the gates closed to the public property. But that was another issue. In a public space, you can't tell people where and where they can't go. So that was another issue, even being outside.
Thank you.
So my next two questions were going to be on venue sizes and outdoor, and also policing of funerals, but I think we've covered that extensively, so unless you have anything to add. The other thing, I was also going to ask about representation to the Scottish Government, but in respect of the timing and nature of the guidance, I wondered whether you'd made representations in that regard, particularly the immediate effect nature of the guidance, and if so, what the response was.
So part of my main role during COVID was to act as a conduit between government and our members, so the funeral director and supplier members of the National Association of Funeral Directors, and that was to ensure that our members were very much at the forefront of any changes that were being made. They were well aware of what they could do and what they couldn't do, and as a result of that, I was in constant contact with the burial and cremation team at the government on an almost sort of daily basis, if not at least 2 to 3 times a week. And so we were constantly conversing, and there was a lot of back and forth. So bearing in mind your questions to me, my lord, I will go back and do my very best to check if there's anything in writing, but a lot of this stuff was just done on the phone. They were just conversational, raising issues, and sometimes written records weren't kept because it was a very, very fast-moving and fast-changing environment that we were operating in. But yeah, it was very much a two-way conversation, and I would go back to them on a regular basis and raise issues that had been raised by our members to us, and sometimes they were localised issues, sometimes they were much broader national issues, and in turn the government, the burial and cremation team would obviously keep us very much abreast of what was going on in terms of the changes. So I think the answer to any of your questions were of did you raise this with them? The answer will be probably yes. I think undoubtedly we did, because we were raising stuff with them on a very, very regular basis.
Mm-hmm.
I know, for example, that we certainly raised with them about some of the rules that came in with immediate effect. I've already mentioned about the number of people that were allowed, but another example was with immediate effect a rule came in that now no longer can we sing at a funeral service. And again, this was about 4:30 in the evening, and we had a funeral the next day at 9:30 in the morning, that they were planning on singing hymns. And so we had to contact the family and say, we cannot sing, we can still have the music played, but nobody is allowed to sing.
Do you recall the response?
Well, yes, because obviously it was a very difficult situation where we're having to tell them this, and that was the first that they were hearing. The response at the funeral was that many people still sang. Now, everybody was wearing face masks, but there is no way of physically stopping people from singing when they were at the funeral. But while the music was playing, some people still sang.
And what was the response from the Scottish Government? Did you ask for them to give you more notice, and were they willing to do that?
Sorry, there you go.
I was just going to say, certainly to my request, that the response was that they accept what I'm saying and that they will try and make representative for that not to happen going forward. But it didn't change that.
Yeah, and I think in a wider sense that was broadly the response we got to pretty much everything. Part of the problem was that there's no minister or anybody within the government who we felt was kind of directly responsible for some of the guidance and rules and regs that were coming out. So we really had to speak through the burial and cremation team, and they were very helpful and they were very happy to converse all the time. But the response was generally, yeah, we hear what you're saying, we'll take it elsewhere. And then they would come back with a response. But broadly the response was, well, this is the guidance, so get on with it, kind of thing. That was that. So there wasn't, if you're asking, was there an element of flexibility in terms of their response and were they listening to us and reacting to that? They were listening to us, but there didn't seem to be any flexibility in our ability to change the narrative.
Thank you. I'd like to move on to the impact on your businesses and working practices. Firstly, funeral directors weren't designated key workers, despite death obviously being one of the most feared outcomes of COVID. What are your thoughts on that, and what were the consequences for you of not having key worker status? You know, I'm thinking of your ability to do your job, accessing places, childcare and so on.
Right. I think the whole issue of key worker status gets to the real heart of the learning out of this pandemic for any future public health emergency. Funeral directors were not designated as Category 1 responders or Category 2 responders or key workers. There were various phrases being used at the time. And what that meant was several things. One, it was very difficult, particularly for the smaller firms, to do their jobs. Now, there are a lot of funeral directors who are small operators, and if somebody fell ill within their family businesses, and if one of them fell ill, then everybody had to self-isolate. We didn't have access to vaccinations or PPE at as rapid a rate as others, and yet we're still being expected to go into the same situations as emergency services were, or other key workers, so care homes and things like that. And it made life very, very difficult. And I think generally the profession felt that it was highly unfair to put people at risk and put people in that situation. Not only that, but particularly in the issue of care homes and nursing homes, which, you know, subsequently during the pandemic and indeed after, we know the rate of spread of COVID in such institutions and such places. Funeral directors who were not designated key workers, so therefore might not have had vaccination or might not have access in the early days to the right PPE, were being asked to go in to remove deceased persons. Now, that puts them at risk, but it also puts everybody else at the nursing home at risk, because we might, or funeral workers might actually indeed be carrying the virus themselves. So in those early days particularly, whilst we felt others were getting the protection of key worker status, we were being asked to do that same role without any of those same protections. And it was very, very difficult. And my colleagues here will tell you the effect it had, you know, on their businesses, on their family lives, on the family lives of their employees. Mm-hmm. And I think that moving forward, one of the big learnings out of this in terms of this profession and the wider sector is that there's legislation under the Civil Contingencies Act 2004 and under the Civil Contingencies Act Contingency Planning Scotland Regulations 2005, which designates Category 1 and Category 2 and other interested parties in terms of responders. Funeral directors aren't mentioned in any of that. So there is an ability to have them enshrined in some sort of law. But also, during the COVID pandemic, the Scottish Government gave, in a sense, temporary key worker status to people who they felt needed it at that time. And that wasn't anything permanent or anything enshrined in legislation, but it allowed people like social care workers, for example, to have that status. So whether it's enshrined in law or whether it's something that can be designated very early in a public health emergency that funeral directors are covered, I don't think we could go through another pandemic and repeat the same mistakes in terms of designating funeral directors as key workers again, because it had a significant effect on our ability to operate.
If I can mention, from somebody who runs a business, this is the first time ever that I felt not only was I potentially putting my own staff at risk, but also their families, because they were coming out to work. We didn't really know right at the start what COVID was, and this was a real concern as someone who runs a business and has 120 staff. And the problem was that they weren't key workers, so sometimes questions were coming back to us from maybe their families about, you know, you're not key workers, and potentially we could be putting not just ourselves at risk, but our families at risk as well. And so it made it very difficult. Another example that I will give is on 2 occasions, I had members of my staff who were called out during the night, in the middle of the night, to remove somebody who had passed away, whether it be at a private house or a nursing home. And they were pulled over by the police to say, why are you out? What are you doing? And they had to just explain who they were and what they were doing. Now, there was no problem with that, but the problem was there was nothing that they could show them. There was no sort of key worker card that they could show the police to say, this is who I am and why I'm out. And at times it just felt quite stressful for the staff as well as for us running the business.
Thank you.
I was just going to give an example of one of the difficulties we have. So as we became busier, as more funerals were happening, we were looking to recruit staff. We needed assistance. And so one of the applicants on them driving to me for an interview was stopped and fined and sent home. We didn't see her again. We offered to pay the fine. But it was that difficult. We actually ended up taking on black cab drivers temporarily for 6 to 9 months to drive our ceremonial vehicles. But it just gave you an idea. And for my own team, I just put something on a headed paper saying this person is a funeral director. And so if they were stopped on the way to work, then they could show that, and hopefully that would be sufficient for the police.
Did it ever, to your knowledge, happen that a person carrying such a piece of paper was stopped?
Yes. My colleague who looks after our Fountain Bridge office was stopped and showed this piece of laminated paper, and it was sufficient because not all the staff wear their funeral director's uniform on the way to work. So they were stopped because they didn't. Well, they didn't. Perhaps if they were dressed as a funeral director, they might not have been stopped.
We had that occasion, as I mentioned, where again we did the similar sort of thing, and they showed that, and the police were sensible and allowed that. Just on the point you mentioned there, James, we actually encouraged our staff not to wear their uniform home because we felt that it would be safer for them to change at work and leave that, and then have a shower at work and then come away in their own civvies, if you like.
Thank you. I understand that some families may want to view their deceased loved ones before cremation or burial. Were you able to continue to facilitate that, or was that completely prohibited by the rules?
I think at the beginning it was very difficult. Traditionally, more than 50% of our families asked to see the person, to say their goodbyes, spend time with the person. And we didn't know enough about COVID. We didn't know how contagious it was, what effect it would have. I think as the guidance came in, even then, I sat and spoke to my team, and particularly our embalmers, about what they were prepared to do, because although the guidance said, yes, you can go ahead and embalm and let people view, I wanted them to be comfortable with that. I wasn't going to force them to do something, but we facilitated viewing. So we kept our funeral offices open. We allowed families to come in and view, only 2 at a time. And right the way through the process, we did that. But it was a difficult thing, and I guess at the beginning it was very much the goodwill of the staff and reassuring them and showing them the government guidance, particularly about infectious. And I don't think we've really spoken about PPE, but we were using masks, so you put a mask on the deceased and you wear a mask yourself, so you have 2 masks, if you like, because as you move someone, it's the air coming out of their lungs that potentially could be the cause. And so it meant we were using a lot more PPE, but it just helped with that situation. When they were viewing, we didn't have any restrictions, so you could still come in. I think it's so important. People like to be able to come in and say goodbye, hold somebody's hand, and so we were able to do that.
Do you want to talk on that?
Yeah, so at the very beginning of COVID, I was working for one of the UK's largest funeral businesses, and at the beginning of the first lockdown, there was a kind of moratorium on no viewing of deceased at all for what was said is for the protection of the staff. That did eventually start to relax a little, where you could do, it was closed coffin viewing, so the lids and everything were on the coffins, but this then just created more issues because everything had to be, you were disinfecting coffins before and after viewings. The coffins were then being moved around a lot more. A lot of the funeral offices where we maybe have a lone worker or a funeral arranger, if we were including viewings, this meant that staff had to arrive at the funeral office with the coffin. Then family were arriving, so your funeral arranger who's there working on their own was now being subject to being face to face with numerous people. So there was no viewing at all to begin with. It did eventually begin to relax and then work along the same kind of rules that James was saying, where they were limited to the amount of people who could view, which again then just caused issues because who gets to view, who's more important than the next person. So it was difficult.
I think I would just reiterate the points that have been made, that some funeral companies had a blanket rule that there was no viewing allowed to take place, and others allowed it. Our company was very much like what James was saying. It was actually my embalming staff who came to me and said that they didn't feel it was right that families should not be allowed to view, and that we allowed everyone to view whether they died of COVID or not from the beginning. I think that what the comments that were being made was that if somebody has been in a nursing home for 6 months and the family haven't been able to go in and see them in the nursing home, and now they've died and they're still being told that they cannot see their loved one, there was just something that wasn't right with that, and it didn't feel right. But it was very much a business decision, and we decided that we would allow all families to view. And again, we restricted it to family bubbles who could come in together. But, we would allow different family bubbles to come in and view the same person at different times if they wanted to. But yeah, there was variances in our industry on that.
Thank you.
I just wanted to add something, sorry. We have a close relationship with the Quaker Social Action Group, and they work as advocates for the bereaved, quite often arranging the funeral or finding a funeral director. And it was interesting at the time because they were sort of championing the fact that as a family you probably pick a funeral director and go ahead and use them. You won't be asking them when you're making that appointment, will I be able to see the person? So, and they were then highlighting the funeral directors that would allow you to see the person and spend time viewing against the other ones, because for the members of the public, there was no way of you knowing that. You would select your funeral director, and only when you encountered them would they then say, well, actually, we won't let you see the person at all. So I think it was difficult from a public point of view. People don't, excuse the phrase, shop around for a funeral director. They will probably have a family one they will go to. And you wouldn't probably ask that question at that time. So I think, so it was interesting a charity was looking at that from the point of view of the bereaved.
Thank you. I want to ask you about the effects of remote working on your practices. How did you find communicating with families remotely? Did you experience issues with digital exclusion? And I also wonder how you dealt with paperwork during the pandemic, and if that's changed since.
Yes, so right at the start of the pandemic, we tried to make everything happen remotely, but bear in mind that a lot of our clients that we are dealing with tend to be of the slightly older generation, and so therefore for them to operate some of the technology was difficult. Before COVID, I don't think any of us had heard of Zoom, and so we were all trying to get to grips with this. But it meant that a lot of the elderly people, or people who just didn't embrace technology, it made it quite difficult. And we arranged a lot of funerals with people over the telephone. We would prefer to do it via a video call, but there were occasions where we might sort of meet them in their garden and make sure that we are separate to chat through things with face masks and things like that on. But initially, all the paperwork still had to be signed, and it meant that we were still having to go to families' houses and get them to sign the physical piece of paper. And there were definitely situations where we would arrive, we would ring the doorbell, pop the paperwork down on their doormat and step right out of the garden, sort of trying to explain where on the paper they had to sign it. and then ask them to put it back down, and we would go forward and pick it up and take it away. So it made it very, very difficult, I think it's fair to say.
Thank you. And did it also affect then your ability to collaborate with religious leaders and humanists who might be conducting funerals?
I think it didn't really affect that hugely. Most of our contact with the celebrants or ministers or whoever it is that's taking the funeral service is done over the phone, apart from at the actual funeral anyway. But there were one or two celebrants or clergy who were taking the funeral who, again, might not have been embracing modern technology, and that they would have preferred a face-to-face meeting. And so sometimes families were having to do that with social distancing, just to discuss the funeral service.
Thank you. I want to turn to PPE now, and I think you touched on that briefly. I understand in your profession you make use of PPE as standard. Can you tell us about that use, but also how it was impacted by the pandemic in terms of availability, pricing, and anything else that might be relevant?
Yes, certainly. I mean, at the beginning, we really struggled. We're a relatively small Scottish cooperative. And so it was a question of going to Screwfix and places like that, our normal suppliers. And I think, as I've already said, we're using at least, if we go and collect a person to bring them into our care from a nursing home, we're both wearing masks as the two employees plus the person we're going to move. We put a mask on them. So you're already using up all that PPE at that point. So we found it very difficult as a relatively small company or corp. How we managed to overcome the problem was our coffin manufacturer is a large corp, Central England Cooperative. They were able to buy PPE in larger amounts, and they would deliver the PPE with the coffins. But I think if we hadn't got that, we really would have struggled. And at what point can your staff carry on their job without PPE? You know, it's vital. I think we were so worried for our team. My business continuity plan at the beginning, I thought we would lose half the staff in terms of having to stay at home, becoming ill. And so then you're thinking, well, how do you manage? And you're trying to keep people in bubbles, but with the lack of PPE. And we also continue to let families to come in to arrange funerals, so you're supplying PPE for them as they come in as well. So I think we overcome it in the end, but it was difficult at the beginning. So. We
certainly encountered very similar. As I've mentioned, we're an independent firm. We're a larger independent firm, but we don't have the backing of, the co-op, like what James mentioned there. And we certainly really encountered difficulty getting PPE. I've mentioned in my witness statement there that face masks particularly were very difficult. We would always want to put a face mask on the deceased as well as our own staff. And at one stage we virtually ran out of face masks, and I personally was going to Screwfix, and they had a limit on the number of face masks they would allow people to buy, and I think we're talking 4. And I went in and pleaded with the staff at Screwfix to allow me to get more than 4, and they allowed me 6. And I've already mentioned I've got 120 staff. We virtually ran out of face masks. But the other thing that we virtually ran out of as well was body bags. Now, body bags is something that we use in practice every time anyway, but particularly during COVID it was very important that we did. What we found was that there were some companies out there so there was a company that normally made outdoor clothing, and they couldn't sell their outdoor clothing, so they actually heard obviously that there was a shortage of body bags, and they started to make body bags using the outdoor clothing. Body bags for us normally cost under £1 a body bag. At this point, when we were really, really concerned that we weren't going to have body bags, we were paying over £30 a body bag from a company like that to get them. Now, it was quite a short period that we had this real fear about the PPE, and then it started to filter through and everything was okay again. But there was a period of time where actually I was lying awake in bed at night, concerned for my staff, concerned for our clients, that we are just not going to have this PPE.
Thank you.
If I may just make a couple of broader points on this particular issue, and this is particularly relevant to our independent members of the association, who are some of them are very small firms. They might only have 2 or 3 people working in them, and therefore the loss of any of those people due to forced self-isolation or the fact they couldn't send their child to school, so had to stay off work, can have a significant effect on their ability to operate a business. Now, they really struggled to get hold of PPE. They didn't have the support of anybody in the outset of this. And as much as Tim said there, he had to drive around, screw fixes around to try and find it. That was a common situation. They were just trying to get hold of whatever they could get hold of. And there was also an issue that because this particular strain of coronavirus wasn't actually named or contained in any national UK contingency planning, nobody was quite sure, and business leaders, had this problem at the start. They weren't quite sure what face masks they should use or shouldn't, what was safe, what wasn't safe. So it's very difficult for them to assure their staff that they were safe and they were using the right PPE. But it's also linked very, very closely to this whole issue again of key worker status. And if I could give you a very brief example. In 2020, in March 2020, the Cabinet Secretary for Health and Sport wrote a letter to social care staff in Scotland, assuring them that they are key workers, therefore they have access to childcare, they have access to PPE, and could go about their job. As I've said, funeral directors didn't get that. So we had this rather anomalous situation where if you work in a nursing home or a care home, you have access to all of this. If you're a funeral director who regularly comes in and out of care homes and spends a lot of time coming in and out of care homes, you don't have any of it. If you visit people who are at home and in a social care environment, who are ill and who might have died or have family members, you have access to all this PPE. If you're a funeral director who then has to go and retrieve the body and pick up the deceased person and speak to the family in exactly the same environment, you didn't. And it goes back to this situation of key worker category 1 responder status. The Scottish Government did set up a hotline. It's worth noting they did set up a hotline which allowed funeral directors a quicker and easier route to accessing PPE, but that took a little while. But I think it's worth pointing out that they did do that and should be praised for doing that. And it gave a route into it. But I think that generally, certainly at the outset of this, the lack of PPE, the guidance on what sort of PPE should be used, we all know around the world, the shortages and the stories that there were in terms of people getting hold of it. It created such a problem, and I think a lot of it could have been eased if funeral directors had got key worker status at the outset.
Thank you. And finally, please would you tell us about the impact of the pandemic on the mental health of professionals in your industry? Massive
effect. As I touched on before, we all work to a certain degree of care in what we do. That's why we do it. My dad was a funeral director for years, and that's the main reason I became a funeral director. I seen the way that he cared for people and what that gave him as a person. So to then have to tell people no, we couldn't do things, having to constantly deal with what we were dealing with on a daily basis, being someone who was having to go out and work, be out in the public, dealing with COVID directly, but not being a key worker, but also being concerned about my own family, my wife, my 2 small daughters at the time. It was a lot to juggle, and then in your workplaces, where the funeral industry is a very emotionally distressing place to be at the best of times, and it takes a certain person to be able to be a funeral director. There's a lot of camaraderie on how we deal with things. People that you work with will understand what you're going through because they've dealt with it themselves. To then not be able to kind of really communicate with them because you're having to separate or bubble or isolate was difficult. You're internalising a lot of stuff then. And the broader thing outside the business, personally I believe there's a mental health crisis going on at the minute, but I believe there's a bigger mental health crisis going to come from COVID. At the time when people were not allowed to hold services or memorial services, we were offering all families the opportunity when COVID or lockdown eventually came out that we would then hold a memorial service for their loved one, where they could have a lot more people there rather than the 5 that were allowed to come. I reckon of 2022, I sent out about 100 letters to families we'd done for the funerals the year before who'd made an interest in holding memorial services, and one came back to us, and a lot of them just said, what's the point now? So I believe there's a future mental health crisis still to come with people who have not been able to process bereavement properly. They've not been able to say goodbye properly to their loved ones. And I believe that's also a big thing in the industry, because this all comes back on us. We feel like we were the ones that stopped them from being able to say goodbye properly or being able to deal with it properly, because we are the face of the bereavement.
Thank you. Before we conclude today, are there any matters that we haven't covered in evidence and aren't included in the statement, or any matters that you just wish to highlight at this point?
I've got maybe just the one, if I may.
Yes.
The pandemic, I think, from the point of view of the funeral profession, highlighted sometimes the difficulty of getting correspondence, if you like, or answers out of the Scottish Government on the basis that we didn't feel there was a particular minister who is responsible for the profession, death and bereavement, essentially. And the activities and operations of funeral directors are covered by several government departments, and therefore several different ministers have responsibility for those. I think moving forward, and particularly as of March the 1st this year, the funeral profession operates under in a regulatory environment with the new Scotland Code of Practice. It would be very helpful in the future generally, or certainly during a public health emergency such as this, and you know, goodness, we all hope there isn't another one, but if there is, that there is a named minister who has responsibility for death, bereavement and funerals, that everybody, profession, bereaved people, everybody knows who they might be. And I think that might help, certainly, across a number of the issues that we've discussed today.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you. Yes, thank you, Ms. Raby. Thank you all, gentlemen. That was most informative and helpful. I'm very grateful to you all.
Thank you very much.
Very good. 10:30, ladies and gentlemen. 11:30. Good morning, Mr. Stephen.
Good morning, my Lord. My Lord, the next panel we have this morning is comprised of 4 people representing the Federation of Burial and Cremation Authorities and some of its members. Those people are Jane Matheson, Jennifer Hamilton, Mike Birkinshaw and Katrina Hartnett.
Good morning, ladies. Good morning, gentlemen. Good morning. Now, when you're ready, Mr. Stephen.
I'm obliged, my Lord. Now, all of the panel participated in a round-table discussion with the inquiry on the 15th of January 2025. Is that right?
It is.
Yes. Thank you. Following that round-table discussion, Mr. Birkinshaw provided a written statement to the inquiry, and that statement has been disclosed to co-participants. For the inquiry's record, the reference for that witness statement is SCI-WT 0342-5 zeros and a 1. Just a gentle reminder to you all at the outset that the hearing is being transcribed by stenographers, so please do try and speak slowly and clearly, and I will do the same. Thank you. We do have a limited time today, so if we do not cover absolutely everything that's contained in Mr. Birkinshaw's statement, then please don't worry. It will be taken into account by the inquiry. Thank you. Now, I'd like to start then by asking each of you to confirm your full name and your roles, both now and during the pandemic, if those were different, as well as a brief description of your respective organisations. And if I could start, please, with you, Ms. Madison, and then we'll work our way down the line. Thank you.
My name is Jane Matheson and I am the Bereavement Services Operational Manager for the City of Edinburgh Council. We have a crematorium, 43 burial grounds, and we run the forensic mortuary service on behalf of the Crown as well. And I am the Chair of the Scottish Bereavement Benchmarking Group.
Thank you. Ms. Hamilton.
My name is Jennifer Hamilton. I am the Crematorium Manager at Clyde Coast and Garnock Valley Crematorium in Ayrshire, which is part of Horizon Cremation Limited. I'm also on the Board of Directors of the Institute of Cemetery and Crematorium Management.
Thank you. Mr. Birkinshaw.
And I'm Mike Birkinshaw. I'm the Chief Executive of the Federation of Burial and Cremation Authorities. I was also, for part of the pandemic, a crematorium manager down in England.
Mr. Birkinshaw, before we move on, could I just ask you to say briefly what the FBCA is and what it does and whom it represents, please?
Yes, thank you. So the FBCA is a member organisation. It represents almost all of the crematoria in Scotland, and we have been in existence for just over 100 years, primarily looking to promote both the practice of cremation, burial and, as is now, new funerary methods, but also looking after member interests and operating in spaces like this as well.
Thank you. Ms. Hart.
Hi, I'm Katrina Hartnett. I'm currently the Bereavement Services Team Leader with Perth and Kinross Council. I'm also the Chair of the Scottish Subcommittee of the Federation, and during the pandemic I was the Manager of Woodside Cemetery and Crematoria in Paisley, which was a private organisation with 1 cemetery and 1 crematorium.
Thank you all very much. Now, time permitting, the aim today will be to cover the following issues with the panel. Firstly, I'd like to touch on pre-pandemic planning, the state of readiness of your organisations for the pandemic. Secondly, moving to the pandemic, I'd like to touch on the changes that had to be made to your ways of working during that time and any impacts that had, obviously, on your organisations and your staff. Thirdly, I'd like to speak about guidance. We've heard some of that this morning from the other panel, but guidance available to your organisations, particularly at the outset of the pandemic, and any impacts that may have had. Fourthly, funerals, and in particular, I'd like to explore the issue of compliance with the restrictions that were put in place in respect to funerals at that time, and again, the extent to which that impacted upon you and your staff. Fifthly, key worker status, and more broadly the recognition of the work that was done by you and your staff during the pandemic. And then finally, any particular points that we may have missed that you wish to emphasise, or any lessons learned, and we'll pick those up at the end. So if we could start then, please, with pre-pandemic planning. I'd like to begin then by asking the panel about the extent to which your organisations were prepared for an event like this, whether any contingency plans were in place, and whether there was any forewarning from the Scottish Government about what lay ahead. If I could start with you, please, Mr. Birkinshaw, on this, and then we'll work our way around the panel. Thank you very much.
So the circumstances around pre-pandemic planning were that, certainly as a group and within the Scottish subcommittee, it was fair to say that crematoria had some planning put in place, and a lot of that was to do with their management plans and to do with their operating guidance, which had been around for quite a number of years, since around 2012, I think. But this was very much around practical things. So this would be making sure you had a supply of consumable items that you would be using if the death rate had increased. Specific influenza pandemic planning was quite sporadic and very centrally held. It wasn't particularly common practice to consult, certainly at crematoria level, pre-pandemic. We were involved as an organisation with a piece of activity in 2011, and a lot of that looked to the previous issues with things like swine flu and SARS, and created a framework to which then, and I'm not sure if it will come up in the questioning, but the framework around how the different variants would impact on death rates. But that was as much as that we were involved in. It was very much NHS led from a central point.
In your statement at paragraph 45, Mr. Birkinshaw, you say that you talk about the swine flu outbreak, I think in 2009, and you say that event had the effect of skewing a lot of pandemic planning. Could you just explain to the inquiry what you mean by that, please?
Yes, so with the swine flu epidemic, it was very much a case that there was only one particular version. So we didn't see the different variants as we now understand through COVID. And it also matched a fairly well-held bell curve of an increase in infections following to an increase in deaths, and then a fairly steady reduction, which worked over around about a 16-week period. There's some slight difference to that. So as a respiratory illness, the assumptions being made, I presume, I'm not a medical expert, but the presumptions being made were that any other respiratory style pandemic would follow the same style of this sort of 16-week crescendo, if you like, of infections followed by deaths. And it was important to highlight that based on the fact that all of the planning then follows through to our part of the sector in terms of things like body storage, capacity for funerals, and ultimately then from the public health perspective, what is actually happening within the death care sector. So that's very limited experience from swine flu actually created a lot of the baseline for pandemic planning going forward.
Thank you. Could you then go on to say in paragraphs 51 and 52 of your statement that the early work assumed that, I think you say, there would be an ebb and flow, but for COVID that wasn't the case. And I think again in 52 you say there was the expectation of a lull that would allow readiness for the next round of deaths, to put it crudely, but to allow for issues like storage. But that wasn't what happened during the COVID pandemic.
No, and you know, hindsight is a wonderful thing. We now look back and see many variants appearing and overlapping. So whilst I would perhaps still reasonably agree with this general principle of a 16-week infection through to death, through to funeral, if you now have multiple variants, you've now got an overlap of those 16-week periods, and it's very quick then to overwhelm the system, which is where we were heading in those very early moments of the pandemic. And certainly as a sector body that's looked at being involved and looked at the capacity of crematoria during the pandemic, it was quite clear that had that planning have followed a different route, if it had had a longer time scale, or if indeed there was an overlapped model that said, well, what happens if we have 5 or 6 different variants at the same time, then potentially there'd have been less concern over body storage capacity and then ultimately funeral capacity.
Thank you. Ms Hartnett, if I could come to you next, please.
Yeah. So the pandemic plans that crematorium had in place all formed part of the management plan that are laid out in the cremation regulations, and they did mainly focus on staff absences and what to do in increased numbers of deaths and, for example, preparing for consumables, making sure you had enough ash boxes, different factors like that. What they didn't mention, I think what nobody could foresee, is shielding, social distancing, staff with underlying health conditions having to isolate or shield. There was nothing in the plans that took on that element of it. We just weren't aware that that would be something that we'd have to consider.
And were you in the same position as the public in the sense of when you were made aware of when
Yes.
restrictions were imposed?
Yes.
There was no advance
Yeah,
warning?
it was just watching different news channels and different things like that. You could see it coming from Italy, for example, and you were just watching it coming and just waiting for it to actually hit us. There was no notification or to get your pandemic plans in place. Have a look at them. We were just the same information as the public had.
Thank you. Ms Mattison, if I could come to you next, please.
Yeah, I would echo what Katrina said. As a local authority, we had fantastic pandemic plans. We had more excess storage prepared. We had temporary mortuaries. We were ready, but what we weren't ready for was isolation, because we hadn't expected it. We've never had to do it before, and that changed how we operated. And I said the plan's only as good as having the staff to carry out the plan.
Ms Hamilton.
We, at the time of the pandemic, were a relatively new cremation authority. At the time, we only had one crematorium operating in Scotland. We had been in operation for 18 months. We are based in North Ayrshire. North Ayrshire Council does not have its own crematorium. So, as Katrina said, as part of the crematorium regulations, the Scottish Burial and Cremation Act 2016 regulations, we had our crematorium management plan in place, but our pandemic planning was fairly basic, in as much as we were planning for mass fatalities, and as part of the plan, our plans were that we would plug into North Ayrshire Council and offer capacity. But because we are not part of the council and the local authority, we had to approach them rather than the local authority approach us to find out our preparedness for the increase in cremations. So that was quite difficult. We felt as if we were kind of out in a limb. We wanted to help, but actually how we plugged into that bigger picture was quite difficult to understand, and nobody was approaching us. We were, and we wanted to let people know that we were there to help and that we could store so many bodies and carry out a specific number of cremations a day. But also, because we're an independent organisation, we run on a kind of skeleton staff. There was only 4 of us, and only 2 of us were qualified cremator technicians at the beginning of the pandemic. So we were worried again about shielding, about staff becoming ill, and having enough cremator technicians to carry on operations if anybody took ill and we had to work in shifts. So there was lots to consider and lots of desperately trying to get more staff trained and qualified as cremator technicians so that we could carry on and work extra shifts.
Thank you. And you mentioned extra shifts, which leads us on, I think, quite neatly onto the next part, really, which is the pandemic itself and any changes to the ways in which you had to work and any additional things that had to be put in place, and any effect that may have had on your staff in terms of workload or otherwise. With this, could I start with you, Ms Mattison, and then we'll work our way back down the line. Thank you.
So our staff, we had staff who volunteered from other service areas who weren't able to carry out their own role, who came and learned how to cremate people, how to bury people, how to work in our chapels, how to provide a service to the public. They could have stayed at home and done nothing, and they didn't. They volunteered, they came out, and we wouldn't have managed without them. We split into different shifts. Teams weren't allowed to change, shifts never met each other. Each part of, if you worked in a chapel, you didn't set foot in near a cremator technician to try and keep ourselves safe. If you weren't in the crematory, you didn't set foot in the admin office. You know, we kept everybody separate, and I think it worked well. It worked very well. That we were a year in before we had even one case of COVID in our service. I think it was really important for us that a lot of emphasis was put on whether a deceased was a danger to us, and it was very evident from the start that as managers we had to understand that it was the living that were a danger to our service, and that if any of our staff were to contract COVID, because we're such small numbers, even with additional help, the service would have stopped.
So, like Ms Hamilton was saying, staff resilience for you was also a concern at that time. Thank you. Ms Hamilton, back to you. Anything you wish to add to what you already said?
Yes, as I said, we were a very, very small staff of 4 during COVID, and 2 of us commuted daily to work from the Isle of Cumbria. Obviously, we were then reliant on ferries, so Caledonian and McBrain were running a reduced timetable, which meant that ferries started later in the morning and finished earlier at night, and that put constraints as well on the times that we were able to operate, because we had to get home. There were no hotels open. We couldn't go if a cremation was going to run over. We couldn't go and chap on a relative's or a friend's door and ask for a bed for the night because nobody was allowed to visit. So we had to very carefully work out who was working when, make sure that everybody stayed well and safe, which was very difficult, again, because of vaccination protocols. But like Jane has said, we were very, very lucky because none of us contracted COVID during the pandemic. So we were able to carry out the services as required. We were working 7 days a week at some stages, and everybody was exhausted. But the resilience of the staff in the crematoria and the cemeteries was phenomenal. And everybody should be applauded for the work that they put in at the time.
Thank you. Mr Birkinshaw?
I think the thing that I can add to what's already been said is from a federation perspective and looking at it across all cemeteries and crematoria, the key difference in all of that pre-pandemic planning was, as was mentioned, around the isolation and the level of risk. The risk being presented to the staff, who ultimately, it's a caring profession. Their ultimate default position is to help, support, to do what they can to minimise the impact of bereavement. And whilst there was and I know we'll come on to restrictions, but whilst there was a sort of a state of January through till March where there perhaps wasn't that very clear guidance and wasn't the understanding, the amount of risk being carried by the staff in cemeteries and crematoria was huge. And you've heard there of how very close as a sector we would have come had we have seen infections rise and the staff be out on isolation. They were still seeing gatherings of 300-400 people at some funerals in those very early months of 2020, and it is a testament to the quality of those people that those services still went ahead, and on the main the service coped reasonably well right across Scotland.
And you mentioned the risk to staff, and I noticed in your witness statement at paragraph 115, I think you say in the early stages of the pandemic there were also concerns over the handling of bodies. Now, I take the point Ms Maddison just made, but was that feedback that was being given to the organisation by members about the uncertainty perhaps of what the virus meant in practice?
Absolutely. It was predominantly because there wasn't any clear understanding or opinion as to whether the virus was still live in a deceased person, and dependent on timescales and how long it is between death and funeral. So there were various pieces of guidance coming out from the likes of the funeral directing profession who had an opinion from a health and safety perspective, we were obviously trying to provide help and support to members, but it was in this space of, well, actually medically nobody really knows yet whether this is something that will continue post-death and whether there should be different ways of dealing with a body that has been diagnosed as COVID positive prior to death. So again, there's another uncertainty for the staff, and it created a very disjointed playing field across Scotland, with certain crematoria doing some things, others not. Coffin carrying would be a great example of where there was difference.
We'll come back to that consistency point in due course. On staff resilience, which was mentioned in staff safety, were you also aware, as the FBCA, of staff being redeployed or extra people being trained to manage that risk?
Absolutely. So many local authorities, of course, would start to see some of their core activities stopping. Street cleansing would be one that certainly slowed down, and they were able then to consider redeployment of their staff into those areas that were needed most. One of them might be their crematorium. We saw an increase in training, as I'm sure the ICCM did as well, that there was a rush to see more trained and qualified cremator technicians, for instance, to be able to have that resilience right across Scotland and in fact UK-wide in that case. Where it caused a problem still is that it takes time to train people. There are certain requirements that they have to meet in terms of the current guidance. And again, in those early days, SEPA wouldn't have changed the requirement in the operating permit to allow a lesser standard of cremator training, still an adequate one, but a lesser standard. So it still required a certain number of cremations to be carried out, as an example. So there was a delay on being able to have qualified staff in those positions that created the resilience in due course.
And in terms of members of FBCA, was there any financial impact on having to change ways of working, whether that's in terms of, I don't know, cleaning and hygiene, for example?
Yes, so again, private companies would be footing the bill for the additional PPE, maybe additional members of staff for those additional requirements as the restrictions came in, and the training. The training also came at a cost. Local authorities perhaps had a slightly different opportunity, because being centrally funded in part, of course, they perhaps had an easier route to get the funding, but ultimately there's still a cost. There was still a requirement to buy that PPE if it was available, of course.
Thank you. Ms Hartnett.
Yes, we had the same situation where we had extra members of staff drafted in from, we were owned by a company called Forsters, and they brought in extra staff for us from other areas of the business. So we trained, for example, the business development director, who stepped forward and he trained into how to be a cremator operator, and he stepped into the chapel. We had staff from accounts who came into the office to take bookings and handle all the paperwork. We split staff up into different areas where we had an admin team who didn't meet the crematorium team didn't meet the burial team. Everybody worked almost in bubbles, and we put staff on different shifts as well to ensure that when you worked with one team that you didn't mix with another team, to minimise the risk of them catching the virus.
Thank you. I'd like to move on now then to that issue of guidance, and it was touched on briefly earlier at the outset of the pandemic in terms of what was available. So I'd like to ask the panel, what was available in terms of guidance to conduct your operations at the beginning of the pandemic? How clear was that guidance that was being offered? And if it wasn't clear, what were the consequences? If I could again start with you, Mr. Birkinshaw, and then we'll work our way around. Thank you.
So the period from, well, certainly December 2019, January 2020 through to mid-March, publicly, of course, people were aware of the infections. We knew that it was happening. We'd seen Italy has always given us the example. There was some really harrowing stories coming out of Italy in terms of number of deaths and how particularly local crematoria were coping. And in the statement I referred to there being a vacuum. There was no centrally coordinated guidance in that period, and not knowing quite how the virus was being transmitted, particularly whether it was something that was a contact issue, it could remain on surfaces, door handles, pews, hymn books, etc., whether it was purely airborne, how long it remained, people started to fill the gaps. So we saw other industry professionals looking to create their own guidance, their own ways of working. We saw difference across different local authorities. So certain ones would have particular restrictions. They would suggest that people had to do certain things, and other crematoria didn't have those because there was nothing that anybody could actually focus on. But I think the really key point in the lack of guidance was the impact on staff. They fielded hundreds, I'm sure that the ladies here will be able to tell you better, hundreds of calls in those beginning months of, is it safe? Should we delay the funeral? How many people can we bring? Is it all right to bring a person who's got a particular illness? And all of those staff were in a position where they had to try, in their empathetic, caring manner, which is the job that, you know, the reason they do their job, to try and work out what might be the best piece of advice, because the worst thing would be to tell somebody to either do it or not do it, and of course that then impact on their funeral. So there was a real vacuum, as I describe it, that was having to be filled by the staff on a day-by-day basis.
You mentioned that uncertainty, and I think you maybe said that funerals were delayed as a result, or people chose to delay funerals. Is that correct?
We certainly saw examples where people weren't sure what was going to happen, and therefore they decided that they might want to delay, particularly because if the rumour mill was working and people said, oh, there might be a restriction or there might be a change. There was a degree that tried to do their funerals a little quicker, which caused a capacity problem to a degree, because people were in a race to have their funeral done, if that's not the wrong way to put it. But then as the virus progressed, it was clear something was going to happen. So then people started to delay slightly and think, well, actually, we need more clarity. So then we see, on the backdrop of the pre-pandemic planning of how the virus works and how the death rate works, we've now got an additional complication, which is that people are making choice about how long, or not as the case may be, their funeral is from death to funeral.
And did that have an implication in terms of, for example, body storage, if the funeral is being pushed back?
Yes, it was less obvious on the way into the pandemic, and we'll talk, I'm sure, as we go on around the implications further on. But there was an impact, and all decisions around funerals have an impact ultimately on body storage and crematoria and cemetery capacity to do funerals. So whilst it wasn't so obvious because the death rate wasn't as high at that point, it certainly existed.
And in your statement, I think you said another result of the information vacuum, as you put it, was that for crematoria it was business as usual. Mm-hmm. What do you mean by that? That
whilst you might see on the news, and I think colleagues have alluded to it, you see on the news something happening in Italy where there is this huge pandemic and a huge loss of life. You could see the narrative generally in the press was that there was something happening and it was a concern and you should be considering what you're doing. And then people at crematoria, working in crematoria, are opening the doors to an ordinary funeral with 350 or 400 people. And those, particularly those days before the initial restrictions, mid-March, it's conceivable, I don't have an example, I wasn't working in Scotland at the time, but it's conceivable that the day before the restrictions you could have had a funeral with 1,000 people at it, and then the next day the restrictions are put in place and all of a sudden that shouldn't be happening.
Thank you. Ms Hartnett.
Yeah, I echo what Mike said. We had very little guidance leading up to the actual date when we went into lockdown. Again, we were just looking at the information that all the other members of the public had. I've got to say though, when lockdown did actually happen, the Scottish Government does have a funeral industry blog, and once the restrictions became clear, or the path that we were going to go down, the blog was very, very helpful to members of the industry. You got regular updates from it, and it was something that you were able to filter down to funeral directors and other interested parties that were involved in the death care industry. Yeah, but just the same, the guidance at the start was wasn't forthcoming at all.
And I suppose a question to you, but to the rest of the panel, is that a concern that would have been fed back to the Scottish Government at that time about that lack of clarity around what could be done around funerals?
Well, I know I did feed it back because we were very much in contact over that time because I think we could all see it. We could all see it coming. And as Mike said, the day before the restrictions, you could have had a service, 8 services with over 200 people at the service each. I think also when the distancing came in and it was 2 metres apart, some chapels were bigger, that they could have more people attending at the 2 metre distance. Some crematoria chapels were smaller, and that would lessen the numbers because there wasn't, to start with, a definitive number of attendees. It was provided they were 2 metres apart. So what you were finding is you were getting some funeral directors who would purposely book another crematorium because they could get more attendees at it, rather than the local crematorium. So once the guidance came into place and it was 10 or 12 people that were allowed at a funeral, or 20, can't remember the way the numbers went, that was a lot clearer for the industry because, yeah, you did find you had funeral directors who would book out with the area just to have more attendees.
And given what Mr Birkinshaw was saying about the headlines about what was happening, but then it was business as usual, to use his phrase, how did your staff feel about that? Was there a concern about safety, for example, if you have that number of people still attending these services? Yeah,
there was a concern about safety, and they were very, very anxious about it, and obviously they have had their own families to consider. They maybe had, I actually had one member of staff who left during that time because her own family member had quite a serious underlying health condition, and she actually just left work because she was that anxious about the pandemic and what was going to happen. So she actually just gave up her job.
Thank you. Miss Mattison, I could come to you, please.
I suppose I really feel that from March onwards, the guidance we had was fantastic from the Scottish Government. We were able to contact the burial and cremation team easily. You could email them and have a response same day. You had funeral industry blog, as Katrina said, that came out regularly. The information came to us, so I suppose I've probably just blanked from my mind what happened before that. But my memories of the time are that the communication was good and that we were able to make contact, we were able to ask for clarity, and that we received it.
Can I ask you about the interpretation of that guidance? We obviously heard from a panel of, say, funeral directors this morning. Did you find yourselves aligned with perhaps the interpretation they were taking of the same guidance?
No, our interpretation was always very much aligned with the industry and with the Scottish Government's interpretation, and it felt that there was a different part of the bereavement industry that were looking to find ways to perhaps circumvent the guidance rather than follow it. So an instruction would come out that you could only have a certain amount of people at a funeral, and we would spend a lot of time working together, talking to our colleagues and different people across the country to make sure that we were all implementing things in the same way, only to find that another part of the industry was using that to advise people, well, you can only have 20 inside, so just bring them all to stand outside, and we'll get you the speakers put on outside, and that way you've got everybody at the funeral and they can hear it. Which then means you've got to go back to the Scottish Government saying, actually, the 20 people inside is meaning that we've got 300 or 400 outside with speakers, should we have the speakers on, which then led to guidance saying, don't put your speakers on as we try and stop people congregating together.
So that was that a source of tension then between?
Yeah, most of the guidance as it changed became a source of tension.
Thank you. Ms Hamilton.
I think I agree with my colleagues. Certainly the blogs that were coming out from the Scottish Government were very clear, they were very concise. We know that the First Minister was on the television every night giving updates and advice, but so was the Prime Minister and so was the Health Minister down in Westminster. And sometimes the advice that we were getting was conflicting. And so people were cherry picking the advice that best suited their circumstances, and they would try and argue with us that Westminster were saying that A could be allowed and we would have to go back and say yes, but the Scottish Government are saying B, and we can't allow it. It's not allowed in Scotland. And so people were confused. I remember going into my work basically and sitting with a live stream of the news running constantly to hear the updates that were coming out multiple times a day from multiple sources. And you were trying to disseminate all of that throughout the day and pass that information back down to funeral director colleagues, out to staff, out to people who were interested and families who were, as you've alluded to, contacting us all the time for information about what they could and couldn't do for the, for the funeral service.
So the issue you're describing then is a different. Mr. Birkinshaw started off by saying it was an information vacuum. What you're saying is
it very
perhaps
quickly became information overload and conflicting information.
Thank you. Unless the panel wishes to add anything else on that subject, no. Right, we shall move on in that case then. I want to move on then, as I said, to funerals, the restrictions that were in place, and in particular the compliance with those. And the inquiry's heard evidence this week, of course, about the impacts on the bereaved in particular regarding those restrictions, whether that's in terms of attendance limits, bans on singing and such like. I'd like to ask this panel's experience about, firstly, the public's level of compliance with the restrictions that were put in place and how this may have affected your organisations and staff in the running of those services. If I could start again, please, with Mr. Birkinshaw, and we'll work our way down the line. Thank you.
So I think the quick answer to these public's compliance was that it was, as you've already heard, there were many different voices and many people trying to find ways to circumvent or even just completely disregard the restrictions that were created. And there was this sort of Scotland versus Westminster disparity, which was entirely unhelpful, because the argument was very much, well, if you can do it in England or Wales, then why not here? And people just didn't want to comply. I think partly it's to do with bereavement, it's partly to do with the emotional nature and the fact that of course the world was in a very odd place anyway, and then all of a sudden you've suffered a bereavement and you find that that's your only opportunity maybe to commemorate and mourn the loss of your loved one, and somebody's now telling you how you can do that. So I understand why people perhaps pushed against compliance, but what it did to the staff that work in cemeteries and crematoria across Scotland was nothing short of horrific. There were people being abused by members of the public because they were being asked to enforce social distancing or just a basic restriction on number, which, as we've heard, changed. So, of course, that also then adds a layer of complexity. And I've said it earlier, the staff within the bereavement sector are caring and empathetic individuals. They're not naturally people that want to police and refuse somebody's request to do something, particularly within that funereal space. So it was completely the wrong sort of people to be policing something that was almost, and again I think the other panel members will have actual examples, but something that was almost unpoliceable because there was no compliance and no general consent to follow the regulation.
And you mentioned about not being the right people to enforce that. I mean, who do you consider perhaps should have been enforcing these restrictions? Well,
certainly from the Federation's perspective, our advice to members at the time would be particularly these examples where, for instance, people were attending en masse outside of a crematory, could even be on the street, for instance. The advice was always that you should be contacting the police. And understandably, I know that that's not just as simplistic as, oh, OK, we'll come and help. We'll take the letter of the law and apply it straight away. But it very quickly became clear that asking for any kind of support from any other body, either the police, the local authority or anybody, it just wasn't going to be forthcoming. And therefore, cemetery and crematoria staff were doing their best to be legally compliant, but certainly from our perspective, and again, other colleagues, I'm sure, it was about their safety as well. So we're now not just worried about them in a group of 300 people because there's a virus circulating. Now we're worried about them in a group of 300 people who, quite frankly, might decide that they just don't like that person enforcing the rules. And 1 versus 300 aren't the kind of odds that we would want to put any of our staff up against.
Thank you. Ms Hartnett, if I could come to you, please.
Yeah, I'll just echo the same. I mean, every bit of guidance that was amended by the Scottish Government came on the back of somebody not complying. We would feed it back and then the guidance would be amended. Simple things like, I don't know if this is the time to say it, but there were exemptions for people who couldn't wear masks, face masks, and people could get a lanyard. And when face masks became mandatory, the amount of people who just flouted the rules and purchased lanyards for exemptions from internet sites, just so that they could come into a chapel and not wear face masks, when you have staff that you're putting at risk by having them in the chapel with all these people. That's when the restrictions lifted more and you could get more people actually in the services. Again, you can understand people are grieving. It's a way to show support for, that's a community event almost, but it was very frustrating when you have staff there at the front line day to day who are concerned about their own safety and their family members' safety.
And did you feel it was left to your staff to manage the expectations of those families?
Yes.
And
yes.
So was anybody else attempt to force these restrictions, or was it just your staff?
No, initial contact with the families would be with the funeral director, and there was many times when you would send the funeral director the updated guidance. And I'll just give one, and most funeral directors did pass it on to the families, but there was one instance I can say that I'd sent guidance out the day before. It'd been a change, and when a booking was to be made, I reminded the funeral director of the change in guidance. I can't remember what change it was, and I said, have you read the guidance? And the words to me were, it's not my job to read the guidance, it's your job to read it and tell me what it says. So it was examples like that were very frustrating to deal with, because as an industry, we all work together and we are all a caring industry, but sometimes it did feel it was left to the cemeteries and crematoria to try and get the guidance out there, because sometimes it was just families' expectations. They weren't aware of what the guidance was through their first contact with the funeral director.
I think the inquiry heard evidence this morning to the effect that the frequency of the guidance changing, perhaps when the families might reasonably not know what the exact position was at that time. Is that fair?
Yeah, I mean, the guidance changed frequently, but it wasn't, from memory, it wasn't like an hourly change. And I think the funeral industry and the service we were providing as funeral directors and as cemeteries and crematoria is important enough that guidance should have been passed on to the bereaved families who were using that service. It shouldn't have been something that was left.
Thank you. Ms Madison, can I come to you next, please?
Yeah, I think it was important to remember as well that the restrictions allowed us to keep our staff safe, and I know that we're going to touch later on key worker status and vaccination, but none of them were vaccinated and none of them had key worker status. So the restrictions were really, really important for them, to allow them to feel safe at work and to feel that they could come in and do a good job. And yet enforcing those restrictions was incredibly difficult, and a lot of them were vilified on social media for it. And again, most of them felt that you work in the industry because you want to do the best for people. You don't want them really to remember who you are afterwards. You want the bereaved to come through your service and only be thinking about themselves and the person that's died, not remembering staff that work in a crematoria. And people were remembering because there was an anger about restrictions and the person that had been enforcing.
And would you give any particular examples that you experienced of where people were pushing at the boundaries of what the restrictions were? Obviously, Ms Hartnett gave an example earlier about lanyards.
Yeah.
In your experiences, anything spring to mind?
We had a service with a piper and you weren't allowed wind instruments in the crematoria, and he just waited till the service started and said, "You will not tell me that I will not pipe at this funeral," and came in and piped at the funeral, and people clapped.
Thank you. Ms Hamilton.
Yes, we also had occasions where it was very difficult to police the public. I remember on one occasion, after the funeral service was finished and everybody had socially distanced within the ceremony hall, they left without shaking hands as they were asked to do, and they all went to the car park where they started to immediately embrace one another. And one section of the family went over to a vehicle and opened the boot and produced a table, platters of sandwiches, strawberry tarts, and out came the flasks, and they proceeded to have the funeral tea in the car park, because of course there was nowhere available for them to go and have a funeral tea after the service. And we were naturally quite incredulous at this. And there was a police car going by on the main road. Our car park is very visible from the main road. And we thought, well, the police will come in and they'll stop this because it's an illegal gathering. We were trying to bring the next service in, as I said, small staff. We didn't have enough people to go and ask them to break up the illegal gathering. And over and above that, you have concerns about doing that anyway, because you just don't know what kind of reaction you're going to get. But yes, you couldn't shout either to tell them to please get in their cars and go home, because we weren't supposed to shout. So it was concerning. That's just one example that I had, but there were many, many.
And do you think the imposition of tiers, for example, where there might be different restrictions in different locations, do you think that complicated the task of trying to enforce the restrictions in place where you were?
Yes, absolutely. Our crematorium is on the borders of a couple of local authorities, and as I said, I live in an island. We were in the lowest level because we had no cases of COVID on the island, but people and funeral directors were encouraging families to come to us because we were in a low tier area, and because our crematorium was new, we had seats as opposed to pews in the ceremony hall, so we were able to have the maximum number of people attend services because the hall was big and we could socially distance the chairs. So yes, people were being encouraged by funeral directors to come to us from different tiered areas, even though they weren't supposed to cross over from one tier to another.
And Mr Birkinshaw, I think that's something you cover in your statement at paragraph 145. You say exactly that. Because families can choose where they can have their funeral or cremation, we also saw a movement of services into lower tiered areas.
And delays of funerals as well. So because those tiers were changing, if there was a reasonable expectation that the tier where you were, your local crematorium or cemetery, then there's the potential that you delay your funeral because the tier will change and it'll make a difference. And the travelling across different tiers, it was certainly from a very basic perspective, was so counterintuitive to the purpose of tiers that in the funeral sector you saw people literally cross-pollinating with no regard, because there was no requirement within those tiers or those restrictions that funerals must be held within a fixed area.
Thank you. I want to move on now then to key worker status and I think wider recognition of the role that you and your staff were undertaking during that period. I'd like to start just by asking firstly, were you classed as key workers? I think Ms Madison's touched on that, and do you consider, if not, whether that was a status which should have been given to your staff? If I could start with you, please, Ms Madison, on this, and then we'll just work our way down the line again. Thank you.
Yeah, so no, we weren't key workers and we weren't priority for vaccination. However, you could leave home to attend a funeral if you had COVID. So we could have 20 people and 200, 300 outside who could have had COVID, and our staff had to go and facilitate that funeral, but they weren't entitled to be vaccinated nor classed as key workers. Key workers status did eventually happen, and priority vaccinations for funeral directors did come in eventually, and we were advised that we could ask for vaccinations by ticking that we were a funeral director. But our staff are not funeral directors. They're bereavement services staff. And a lot of them didn't feel comfortable doing that. But it was distressing for them. It was distressing to manage a situation like that as well, when you look at what you're seeing happen in Italy with funerals that couldn't take place. And it didn't happen in Scotland, and that was testament to the staff that came in and worked so hard, carrying out a job that they're dedicated to, and yet they felt there was no recognition of the risk that they were putting themselves at. And it would have been easier for us to have had staff vaccinated. We might not have had to have been so strict with bubbles and teams. We had people working 2 days on, 2 days off. It might have made life just that little bit easier had we had them vaccinated, and certainly it would have made them feel that they were valued.
And to your knowledge, again, was that a point that would have been fed back to the Scottish Government at that time?
On more than one occasion.
And do you know by whom? Would that have been on an industry-wide basis or through individual members?
It would have been through individual members and industry-wide.
Okay. Thank you.
And I think they still, even after COVID, a lot of our organisations had written asking for bereavement staff to be acknowledged in the same way that health and social care staff were, but we were refused.
Thank you. Ms Hamilton.
Yes, the fact that we weren't given key worker status, I know, was problematic. Not problematic, it was an annoyance for me. Me and a colleague both live on the island, and obviously there was no unnecessary travel supposed to be happening during COVID. We had the additional expense every day of having to take a car on and off the island to get to work. There was no public transport. We had to pay the full fares every day, 5, 6, 7 days a week to get to work. And we were questioned by the police at the ferry slip every day to ask if our journey was necessary. And of course it was very necessary. But every day we went through the same rigmarole, and it got to the stage where it was really upsetting, actually, you know, not to be recognised as performing this crucial role during the pandemic. And also not to be given the vaccine at the time that the funeral directors were given the vaccine. And because we didn't work for a local authority, it was even more difficult for us to get the vaccine. Local authority workers seemed to be a wee bit further up the line than us. So when we did eventually get it, it was a huge boost, but it was too little, too late for us all, really.
Thank you. Mr Birkinshaw?
I think I'd just like to add to it that I mentioned earlier the caring and empathetic nature of people that work in bereavement services more widely, but in particular for us, cemeteries and crematoria. They wouldn't necessarily go and shout from the rooftops about the work they do, or want to be seen or recognised perhaps in any obvious way, because it's the job they've chosen, it's a vocation. But when you look at it through the lens of a pandemic, I mean, the example there of being questioned every day about your travel arrangements as to whether they're necessary is symptomatic of the fact that cemetery and crematoria workers are not seen most of the time, and that's a good thing, certainly from our perspective. But from a legal perspective, there is nothing that says that they are a necessary requirement for society in any given pandemic as we're discussing today, or indeed time of national emergency. And the reality is that without all of the bereavement services sector, funeral directors, mortuary workers, cemetery and crematoria staff, society has a huge, huge problem, and they do owe a huge debt of gratitude, particularly in the pandemic, to the quality of the work that was done. And even now, there are still issues that staff in cemetery and crematoria can't get access to certain health services and such like, because they are effectively a very ordinary standard workforce rather than one that is recognised as for the work that they do that has an impact on society.
Thank you. Ms Hartnett.
Yeah, I would just agree exactly with the rest of the panel. It probably to our own credit, because we are very much the unseen industry.
Yeah.
So it's probably just that we just weren't considered as key workers. But yeah, we had to. We got vaccinated, and again we had to say that we were funeral directors to get the vaccine, because there was just no acknowledgement or recognition of bereavement services staff. And as I say, we had team members who did lose family members, and they still came back and came to their work to carry out that service. And as I say, I'm just very, very proud of the industry and how the whole industry coped during that time.
Thank you. Which brings us then, I think, finally then, just any particular points that you wish to make, whether that's in terms of lessons learned or otherwise, and obviously this will be covered to an extent in Mr Birkinshaw's statement, but if there's any particular points you wish to emphasise before we close, now is the time. If I could come to you, Ms Matheson, in the first instance, and then we'll again just work our way down.
I don't think so. I think for me the most important part is the fact that the recognition of the service that a bereavement service provides to society was not acknowledged and still isn't acknowledged. And when you look back at what you saw happening across Europe, it didn't happen in the United Kingdom, and it didn't because of the staff that are here. The staff gave it their all. And yeah, it's quite sad when you think about it like that those people worked so hard and they weren't acknowledged in any way.
Yes, I agree. I think that we were completely overlooked. I know that, for example, blue light workers were lauded throughout the pandemic, but blue light workers, and this is the one that got me, includes cave rescuers. Now, nobody should have been out going through caves during the pandemic anyway, but cave rescuers were given priority status over us. I don't know, it's ridiculous to say, but they were able to get into supermarkets and get 10% off their shopping, whereas we, again, had to go and do huge shifts at work and then try and go and get a loaf or a packet of noodles, just something to fuel you to go back and do the job the next day. And we weren't recognised, and it just felt really unfair at the time, and it still does.
Thank you. Mr Birkinshaw.
I think I echo everything that's been said, but I just want to draw the inquiry's attention to the fact that in 2020 there were over 45,000 cremations in Scotland. That's 45,000 cremations conducted by the ladies here to start with and members that I represent, and yet, as you've heard, there's absolutely no recognition at all of that as a workforce, and that doesn't include the burials, of course. There was a high number of burials. A similar number in 2021, a similar number in 2022, and actually in 23, 24 and 25 and forever onwards will be those funerals. And I really feel passionate that the staff in this bereavement sector really do need to be recognised for the quality of the work they do, but also its impact on society. We could quite easily have seen television newscasts of coffins and caskets queuing up outside the crematorium, as we saw from Italy. And part of it is because we didn't see the same level of of infection and the same level of deaths is one reason, but it is in no small part to the staff that work in the cemeteries and crematoria across Scotland.
Thank you. Ms Hartley.
Yeah, I don't think I need to add anything else, to be honest with you. Just extremely proud of the industry that I've worked in now for almost 30 years. Again, very much in the background, but very small and dedicated teams that carry out an essential service.
Thank you. My Lord, I don't have any further questions for the panel.
Thank you very much, Mr. Stephen. No, I've got nothing to add. Thank you all very much for coming, and thank you for your evidence, which is very helpful. I appreciate that. Very good. Now, let me check. 2 o'clock. 2 o'clock it is. Thank you.